Las Corla, I certainly agree with some of the issues that have been raised by previous speakers, but we do have problems with this bill, and I'll explain some of the issues that concern me. First of all, certainly, yes, there is a problem with people having to pay management fees, and there most certainly needs to be regulation in relation to what management companies can require of residents in managed estates. I think also that, and I acknowledge that there is an interdepartmental review. I think the so-called MUD bill, the multi-unit development bill, certainly needs to be looked at and needs to be amended. And I also have met with the network of apartment owners, and they have genuine concerns in relation to, for example, some people who aren't owner-occupiers not paying their management fees, and they've been stuck with the entire amount. Also, the issue of sinking funds and real concern that the long-term, more expensive maintenance issues that arise will simply be unaffordable. And I think they are really genuine concerns, and they need to be addressed. I think particularly in some kind of regulation and recognition of the issues. But I suppose the problem that I have with this bill is that it doesn't distinguish between apartment blocks and housing developments that have management fees. And I can't see why other payers of local property taxes who live in housing estates that are maintained by the local authority, why they would have to subsidise people who are living in private estates that should be taken in charge. I mean, if they're houses, then they should be working towards taking in charge, rather than simply keeping them as private estates indefinitely into the future. As somebody who believes in equity in these things, I don't see why the majority of housing estates where people own their homes privately, where they maintain their own back gardens and their own driveways, etc., that they should somehow or other be subsidising people in some cases gated communities that they can't even access. So I think there is a real problem here. And now, if it was, I do think that apartment blocks are different, and there are issues with regard to apartment blocks that genuinely do need to be dealt with in some way that is fairer to those who have to pay. But I think this is taking in some cases, quite expensive management charges, and it doesn't deal with, say, for example, I think there are cases now where private, first of all, they may be gated, but secondly, they may have things like concierge services or gyms or whatever, and are those things to be somehow or other subsidised by the public purse? I understand. I'd be interested in your response, because I'm not knocking completely what you're trying to do. But I understand also. I wasn't aware of this personally, but I've been told that there is one particular development that actually has its own private gate onto the local Lewis stop, and that gate can't be accessed by other people. So, if this is essentially subsidising people who are very well off, and is depriving, I think it was Deputy Fleming who had originally said that the cost would have been about 17 million euros. Well, if that's to come out of public funding for things like parks and libraries and public roads and footpaths and playgrounds, well then, I would certainly want to limit it and not have it open to whatever the management company wanted to charge and whatever the management company wanted to provide. Now, I know that you have it limited to a third of the local property tax, or a third of the management fee, or 300 euros, whichever is the lower amount. So obviously there is some control there, but still, if the 300 euros is the lower amount, then you're talking about pretty expensive homes. If a third of the management fee, if a third of the management fee is higher than 300 euros, then it's fairly significant. So anyway, maybe you might explain that, because it does seem to me that it just leaves too many loopholes for, for very elite and exclusive developments to somehow or other benefit from something that poorer people living in less fancy houses have to actually pay. So I suppose that is my main concern with the bill. But I do recognise that there are, serious issues for people who are paying management charges. But the other thing that I can't see, and it's something I have to agree with Minister Canny on, I've looked, look, if you can confine this to owner-occupiers, fair enough, but I can't find it in the bill. I genuinely can't. I've read through the bill and I can't find anywhere where it simply applies to owner-occupiers. And I'm not sure whether you could do that anyway. You know, if there's a landlord, if somebody owns a property and is renting it out, you know, I don't know whether you can actually force them to pay the full amount while, you know, somebody else doesn't pay the full amount. And by no means am I making an argument for landlords to be subsidised. I'm not. But I just can't see it in the bill. So maybe Deputy O'Brien would clarify that at some stage. But as I said, I know there are issues with regard to the whole issue of management charges, and particularly the issue that in some cases estates are forced, more or less, or pushed into basically keeping the estates in private ownership rather than what is the norm in most parts of the country, is that the local authority takes estates in charge after a certain period of time and then maintains the open spaces and the grounds and so on. And I think that's a better principle. I just think that we should have, where there are numbers of people living together, that it should be public roads and they should be, you know, public spaces. They shouldn't be just for the people who happen to live in that area. So as a principle, I'm concerned that we would be consolidating that practice, and I would be particularly concerned if they are gated communities. In other words, if the general public can't go in and out of them. By all means, let your private home be, and you know, inside your front gate, be your own property. But you know, a whole estate that is only for people who live in the area seems to me to be something that is dividing communities. I don't think that's a good principle. I do understand, as I say, that there are issues, but I don't also. I don't think that the idea that people are in principle against a property tax, I find it a bit confusing to hear it coming from people of the left, because my view as a left-wing person, and generally in European countries the view of left-wing parties, would be to take some of the tax burden away from work, whereas in Ireland a very high proportion of our tax is taken from income. But we need to spread that to include wealth, and in some cases homes are wealth, particularly expensive homes. So, I mean, the principle of having a tax on property to me makes sense from a left-wing perspective. And I know that there are other left-wing parties here in this chamber who don't take that position, but I think they're quite out of step with left-wing parties in Europe generally. And I have no problem standing up and saying that I believe that there should be tax on property, simply because there's only so much tax to go around to pay for all of the public services that we want. And if we want good public services, then they have to be paid for by tax. And yes, by all means, tax the wealthier people, and I've no problem with increasing tax on wealthy people, but I think other forms of wealth, as well as income, also needs to be taxed, and I think that has to include, in some way, has to include property. So that's where I'm coming from. As I say, I can understand that there is a problem, and that Deputy O'Brien's bill is designed to deal in some way with that problem. But I'm not sure that I just think that it's spread too widely, and you know, it's basically, I suppose, encouraging the idea that if you have private expensive homes that have management fees, then somehow or other you're not going to ever ask the council to take them in charge and make them equal to the kind of housing estates that the rest of us live in.
Very good.